For centuries, the Book of Enoch has lingered at the margins of religious history, divisive, deeply unsettling, and quietly powerful. It brims with heavenly visions, encounters with mysterious celestial figures, and narratives that never made it into the Bible most of us grew up with. Not long ago, researchers decided to feed the text into Grok, the artificial intelligence developed by Elon Musk's company X AI, curious about what patterns and connections might emerge when a machine examines its language free from the weight of centuries of theological debate. What came back was far more than a summary. It was a collection of observations that are prompting people to rethink what this ancient text genuinely represents. If you're just discovering this channel, stay with us. We explore ancient writings, forgotten history, and the kinds of questions most creators tend to sidestep. The book the world wasn't meant to read. So what is the Book of Enoch exactly, and why did it vanish from most versions of the Bible? Known also as First Enoch, this is an ancient Jewish religious work attributed to Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah. Scholars typically place its composition somewhere between 300 and 100 BCE, though many believe certain portions are quite a bit older than that. The text takes Enoch through a succession of journeys into the heavens, his encounters with angels, both loyal and fallen, and sweeping prophetic visions covering divine judgment, the architecture of the cosmos, and the eventual end of history. For the majority of Western Christianity, this book essentially ceased to exist. It was excluded during the early church councils, and for more than 1,000 years, the complete text remained virtually unknown throughout the Western world. The single notable exception was the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which kept it intact within its official canon, written in the ancient Ge'ez language. That preservation is ultimately what allowed the full text to reach the West at all. Scottish explorer James Bruce brought copies back from Ethiopia in 1773. Here's why that detail matters. The Book of Enoch is quoted directly in the New Testament letter of Jude, and a great many scholars believe it shaped the thinking of the New Testament authors far more broadly. It seems nearly certain that Jesus and those around him would have known this text intimately, so the question people keep returning to is a straightforward one. Why was it removed? Was it considered too extreme, too precise, or did it contain ideas that those in religious authority would rather keep out of general reach? That unanswered question is precisely what motivated people to run it through an AI to begin with, a means of examining the text stripped clean of centuries of religious and political influence. Grok is the AI system created by X AI, launched in late 2023 and widely regarded as more willing than certain competitors to engage with unconventional or provocative subject matter. Built on a large training data set, it's capable of sophisticated textual analysis, identifying themes, comparing literary structures, and translating complex ideas into accessible language. Using artificial intelligence to analyze ancient religious texts is nothing new. Computational tools have been applied to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Torah, and the New Testament for years now. What sets the experience of running the Book of Enoch through a conversational system like Grok apart is simply a matter of accessibility. Everyday readers, not just academics with institutional journal access, can now ask layered, nuanced questions and receive genuinely substantive answers. You can ask it to compare chapters side by side, follow recurring imagery across the text, or unpack dense theological arguments in plain terms. What people discovered when they tried this was that Grok didn't merely compress the book into a digest. It brought structural patterns, thematic groupings, and theological tensions to the surface that had largely remained buried inside academic papers very few people ever actually read. It also drew connections between Enoch and other ancient traditions, ranging from Mesopotamian mythology through to the Dead Sea Scrolls, in a way that felt genuinely revealing rather than just scratching the surface. So let's be clear about what's actually going on here. Grok isn't making any supernatural claims. It's doing exactly what language models are built to do, finding patterns within text and drawing connections in a clear, readable way. But when the source material happens to be something as ancient and layered as First Enoch, those patterns end up being genuinely striking: the Watchers and the Nephilim. One of the very first things Grok locked onto was the section called the Book of the Watchers, which runs through chapters 1 to 36. This portion introduces a group of celestial beings, The Watchers, who were originally meant to observe humanity, but instead made the choice to come down to Earth, take human women as wives, and produce a race of hybrid children known as the Nephilim. And this isn't some minor side story. It forms the entire backbone of the book's opening section. Grok highlighted how this narrative ties directly into and dramatically expands upon just a handful of cryptic lines in Genesis 6, where sons of God take human wives and father giants. But Enoch goes considerably further than Genesis ever bothers to. It names the Watchers one by one, identifies their leader as Samyaza, and lays out the forbidden knowledge they passed along to humanity: metalworking, cosmetics, sorcery, and astrology. Grok also flagged something scholars have been discussing for decades, that the Watcher story bears a striking resemblance to Mesopotamian traditions surrounding the Apkallu, semi-divine figures from Sumerian and Babylonian mythology, who were said to have come down from the heavens and taught humanity the foundations of civilization. The similarities are close enough that some researchers believe both traditions actually trace back to an even older common source. What made the AI genuinely useful here wasn't that it uncovered anything new. It was the ability to map all of these cross-cultural connections at once, laying them out side by side for readers who would otherwise need to dig through several completely separate fields of study. The Nephilim, the children born from the Watchers and human women, are described in Enoch as enormous giants who consumed everything humanity produced, then turned violent against people and eventually against each other. When they died, the text tells us, their spirits became the evil forces that still wander the earth. Essentially, Enoch offers its own explanation for where demonic activity originates. That's no small theological statement. And Grok's analysis explored how that claim sits alongside mainstream Jewish and Christian thought. What it found is that Enoch fills a gap the canonical Bible leaves completely open. The Bible references the Nephilim, but never explains their ultimate fate or where evil spirits came from. Enoch answers both questions directly. Grok also noted that this same basic archetype, powerful, corrupting hybrid beings, shows up across ancient cultures that had no contact with one another. The Greek titans, various Sumerian demigods, and certain fallen figures within Egyptian tradition. To be absolutely clear, none of this proves these beings were real. What it does demonstrate is that the idea of hybrid figures corrupting the world is something close to a universal story pattern across ancient civilizations. That's a genuinely fascinating anthropological thread worth pulling. Taken all together, Grok's reading of the material suggested that the Book of Enoch was never some fringe curiosity sitting at the edges of religious thought. It was a fully developed, internally coherent cosmology, one that addressed the origin of evil, the structure of the spiritual world, and humanity's ultimate destiny with far greater depth than any of the Bible's canonical books ever attempt. The fallen angel roster and the astronomy that really shouldn't be this precise. One of the more remarkable things Grok pulled out of the text is that Enoch doesn't simply hint at a fallen angel narrative. It names names. Beyond the leader Samyaza, the book lists roughly 200 Watchers who descended together onto Mount Hermon, with several of them assigned very specific roles: Azazel, Armaros, Barakal, Kokabel, Zachiel, and others. Azazel in particular receives special attention. The text attributes to him the teaching of humanity regarding the crafting of swords, shields, and armor, essentially the tools of warfare, as well as the instruction of women in ornamentation through metalwork and jewelry, something the text presents as a form of corruption. Divine judgment falls most severely on Azel, who gets bound and thrown into darkness to wait for his final punishment. Grok drew a direct connection to Leviticus 16, where the scapegoat ritual sends one goat out into the wilderness for Azazel, a phrase that most Bible readers have never had properly explained to them. Enoch provides the missing background, and Grok made that connection clear and straightforward to follow. This is exactly where AI-driven analysis of ancient texts proves its value. Making that same connection by hand means digging through multiple translations and a whole pile of academic writing. Grok collapsed that entire process into something an ordinary reader could actually understand and then explore further on their own. Chapters 72 through 82, referred to as the Book of the Luminaries, represent one of the oldest portions of the entire text. Fragments of it were discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, dated to around 200 BCE. This section carefully tracks the movements of the sun, the moon, and the stars in remarkable detail for its era. Grok's analysis pointed out that it establishes a 364-day solar calendar built around 4 seasons of 91 days each, something distinct from the lunar calendar that dominated later Jewish practice, but consistent with the calendar system found in other Dead Sea Scrolls material, including writings connected to the Essene community. That alignment has led certain scholars to suggest that the group responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls had a direct connection to the tradition from which Enoch emerged. Grok also observed that even though the astronomy doesn't hold up by modern standards, it reflects a genuinely sophisticated system of observation, one that required sustained and careful monitoring of the night sky. The description of the sun rising and setting through 6 gates on each horizon corresponds to something real. The sun's points of rising and setting do shift throughout the year, and tracking those changes was the very foundation of ancient calendar construction. This section isn't mythology in the conventional sense. It's an effort at a systematic, observation-based account of how the sky operates, written by someone who clearly spent years watching it closely. Chapters 83 through 90 contain what are called the dream visions. Enoch recounts 2 of them. The first is a terrifying vision of a flood destroying the earth. The second is a lengthy allegorical retelling of history known as the animal apocalypse, in which major biblical figures are depicted as animals. Adam and Eve appear as white bulls, the Israelites as sheep, and their oppressors as predatory creatures. It reads almost like a storyboard covering the entire sweep of Israelite history, compressed into a menagerie of horns, claws, and wool. Grok's reading of this section leaned on what historians refer to as vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy written after the events it claims to predict. It flagged the fact that portions of the animal apocalypse are so precise about actual moments in Israelite history that they appear to have been composed with full knowledge of those events already in hand. This isn't a fringe argument, it's a widely accepted scholarly observation. And it raises genuine questions about exactly when the various sections of the book were written and by whom. Scholars generally place the animal apocalypse in the Maccabean period during the 2nd century BCE, since its coded imagery appears to trace the Jewish revolt against Seleucid rule closely enough that it's frequently used as a dating reference point for the entire section. But the vision doesn't end with recorded history. It pushes ahead into a final battle, the defeat of evil and a world rebuilt in peace. Grok noted that this end times vision shares unmistakable structural similarities with the Book of Revelation, the same fundamental sequence of tribulation, divine judgment, and ultimate renewal. The honest and open question this raises, one that Grok presented without choosing a side, is whether the author of Revelation drew directly from the Enochic tradition. The textual overlap is close enough that most scholars would say yes. This is the point where things became genuinely attention-grabbing for a lot of people. Chapters 46 through 48 describe a heavenly figure referred to as the Son of Man, a being who existed before creation itself, sits alongside God, and will judge the wicked while vindicating the righteous at the end of days. That phrase carries enormous weight, because Son of Man is the title Jesus applies to himself more than any other throughout the Gospels, roughly 80 times across Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In Mark particularly, Jesus uses the phrase in contexts that align closely with Enoch's version, a coming figure of cosmic authority and judgment. Grok's comparison highlighted that the specific qualities assigned to the Son of Man in Enoch existing before creation, holding divine authority, serving as judge, and being tied to light and wisdom, match what the New Testament claims about Jesus so precisely that scholars have argued over the connection for decades. Some believe Jesus deliberately invoked the Enochic title to signal exactly what kind of figure he was claiming to be. Others see the influence as more diffuse and broadly cultural. Either way, this is not a new theory. It has been part of academic theology since the 1800s. It simply remains invisible to most people sitting in a pew because the Book of Enoch never made it into their Bible. It's the kind of gap that once you notice it is very difficult to stop noticing. There is a genuine wrinkle worth mentioning here, one that Grok flagged when pressed on just how solid this connection really is. The section containing the Son of Man material, known to scholars as the Book of Parables, is conspicuously absent from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Every other major section of Enoch turned up at Qumran in some form, but not this one. Scholars treat that absence seriously rather than dismissing it, since it suggests the parables may have developed later or within a different community than the rest of the book. That doesn't undermine the Jesus connection, since the parables were clearly circulating well before the 1st century, regardless of what Qumran happened to preserve. But it is precisely the kind of nuance that separates careful scholarship from a neat talking point. So why was it left out? Grok's answer, when pushed directly, was layered rather than straightforward. The short version is that the Book of Enoch was never officially part of a single Bible to begin with. It was excluded from different canons at different times and for different reasons. The rabbinic authorities who finalized the Hebrew Bible in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE left it out, possibly because its content, especially the Watcher's narrative and its detailed angelology, read as dangerous or even heretical during a period when Jewish religious identity was under enormous pressure following the destruction of the Second Temple. On the Christian side, the councils that shaped the biblical canon, Nicaea in 325 CE and Carthage in 397 CE, debated a lengthy list of texts. By that point, Enoch had already been circulating for centuries and had clearly shaped Christian thinking, but its vivid fallen angel imagery and elaborate cosmology may have made it difficult to fit into the theological framework the early church was constructing. Grok laid out several scholarly explanations here and was clear that no single clean answer exists. What it did flag as genuinely interesting is that the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, home to the oldest continuous Christian tradition on earth, never removed the book because it stood entirely outside the Roman process that defined the Western canon. Whether Enoch was left out or simply never brought in really comes down to which Christian tradition you happen to be asking. It's a reminder that the Bible was never one fixed, universally agreed upon document. It was, and still is, a collection of overlapping decisions made by different communities at different points in history. The Dead Sea Scrolls, divine justice, and echoes across cultures. One thing no serious scholar argues against: fragments of the Book of Enoch were recovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, specifically pulled from Cave 4 at Qumran, first excavated by Yosef Milik in the early 1950s. The material covers roughly 11 separate Aramaic manuscripts of Enoch itself, spread across a larger number of individual fragments dated to somewhere between roughly 200 and 100 BCE, along with several additional Aramaic manuscripts of a related text called the Book of Giants, which describes the descendants of the fallen Watchers and appears to have circulated alongside Enoch within the same scribal circles. That places Enoch among the best represented non-canonical texts recovered at Qumran, with more surviving manuscript witnesses than several books that actually made it into the Old Testament. Grok emphasized this when questioned about how credible the text's history genuinely is. Its point was clear and direct. The Dead Sea Scrolls establish beyond any reasonable doubt that the Book of Enoch was widely known, extensively copied, and regarded as meaningful scripture by at least one major Jewish community during the time of Jesus and those around him. This isn't guesswork, it's documented archaeology. Worth noting is that the astronomical sections found at Qumran are older than the fully compiled edition of the book, which suggests that different portions of Enoch circulated on their own before being woven together, a pattern that shows up repeatedly across ancient religious literature. Think of it less as a single book, composed in one session, and more as a living manuscript tradition, expanded, recopied, and reorganized by generations of scribes across centuries. Anyone curious enough to examine the physical evidence firsthand can find digitized scroll fragments through the Israel Antiquities Authority's online archive. A substantial portion of the Book of Enoch is given over to divine judgment, the destiny of the wicked, the vindication of the righteous, and the eventual collapse of those who misuse power. Grok's exploration of this theme generated some of the richest material in the entire analysis. It observed that Enoch's theology of judgment is considerably more structured than anything found in the canonical Old Testament, describing distinct holding places where the dead await their judgment, sorted according to how they lived their lives. This represents one of the earliest fully developed afterlife theologies within the Jewish tradition, and it maps closely onto ideas that reappear later throughout the New Testament. Grok also drew attention to the Epistle of Enoch, chapters 91 through 108, which contains the Apocalypse of Weeks, a schematic account of history divided into 10 ages, and delivers sharp, socially loaded condemnation aimed at the wealthy and powerful who take advantage of the poor. A number of scholars have drawn comparisons between its tone and the New Testament's Epistle of James, as well as the warnings Jesus issues in the Sermon on the Mount. What emerges across the entire text, according to Grok, is a steady and uncompromising moral seriousness about justice, a deep concern for those without power who suffer, and firm accountability demanded of those who hold it. Perhaps the most thought-provoking result from the whole exercise was Grok's comparative sweep across other mythological traditions. It identified narrative structures appearing in cultures that, according to conventional historical understanding, had no direct contact with ancient Israel. The flood that Enoch prophesies clearly echoes the Sumerian tale of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which predates the biblical flood account. But Grok went even further, drawing structural parallels between the descent of the Watchers and the Sumerian Anunnaki, sky-associated divine beings said to interact with humanity directly, while also pointing out similarities with the Greek myth of the Titans passing forbidden knowledge to humans before Zeus locks them away. Even Prometheus, bound to his rock for giving fire to mortals, fits the same basic shape, a boundary-crossing act of forbidden generosity punished by those in power above. To be clear, none of this proves that a shared historical event ever took place. What it suggests, from a scholarly standpoint, is either genuine cultural diffusion, stories traveling through trade routes and contact between peoples, or separate cultures independently reaching for the same narrative tools to explain the same universal anxieties, the origin of evil, the danger of forbidden knowledge, and the consequences of crossing lines that were never meant to be crossed. What Grok offered wasn't a brand new theory, but a clear and well-organized map of connections that would otherwise require working through a dozen separate mythology texts on your own. Where Grok runs into its limits, what scholars actually say, and the bigger picture. It's worth being straight about where academic opinion on Enoch really stands today, because the text is taken far more seriously by researchers than popular media sometimes suggests. Scholars like James Vanderkam and George Nicholsburg, who authored the standard academic commentary on First Enoch as part of the widely respected Hermenia Critical Commentary series, have dedicated entire careers to establishing its theological depth and historical significance. Gabriel Boccaccini at the University of Michigan founded the Enoch Seminar in the early 2000s, an international research group devoted specifically to Enochic Judaism and its influence on both early Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism, which has since held recurring international conferences, bringing together specialists from across the entire field. This is mainstream, peer-reviewed scholarship, not fringe speculation. Grok's framing of all this is that the influence of the Enochic tradition on early Christianity is genuinely well established within academic circles. The live debate isn't about whether that influence exists. It's about how strong and how direct it actually was. Did early Christians draw on Enochic ideas about the Son of Man and angelology? Almost certainly. Did the Book of Enoch shape the way Jesus' own followers understood him? Many scholars argue exactly that. The gap between what specialists have known for decades and what the average reader has ever come across is enormous. And that gap is precisely what makes AI-assisted analysis like this so valuable to a wide audience. It didn't create new scholarship, It made existing scholarship reachable. In fairness, it's worth spending real time on what this kind of analysis simply cannot do, because not every claim circulating about this experiment is well grounded. Grok is a language model. It identifies patterns in text and draws connections based on its training data. It cannot verify historical events, confirm anything supernatural, or tell us whether what Enoch describes actually occurred. Some claims circulating online suggest that Grok proved the Book of Enoch is historically accurate, or that it confirmed the Nephilim existed. That's simply a misreading of what the tool is capable of doing. What it can do is analyze literary and theological patterns, draw cross-textual comparisons, and present existing scholarly viewpoints in a clear and accessible way. What it cannot do is settle debates that historians, archaeologists, and theologians have been arguing over for centuries. Whether the Watchers were literal beings, symbolic figures, or pure myth isn't something any AI system is equipped to resolve. And Grok says as much when asked that question directly. There's also the translation problem. Enoch has come down to us through Aramaic and Hebrew fragments alongside a complete text in Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language of the Ethiopian Church, and every English translation out there involves interpretive decisions. Grok's analysis leaned heavily on English translations, specifically R.H., Charles's 1917 version, and the more recent E. Isaac translation found in the Old Testament pseudepigrapha collection. Different translators highlight different things, and what the AI produced reflects those choices. That's no reason to throw out what it discovered. It's a reason to treat the whole thing as a doorway into deeper reading rather than the final destination. To its credit, when pushed directly on these limitations, Grok owns them without dancing around the issue. The Book of Enoch is a genuine ancient text of real historical weight, kept alive by the Ethiopian Church, left out of most Western Bibles, and confirmed as authentically old through the Dead Sea Scrolls. Running it through Grok didn't reveal anything supernatural. What it actually did was take patterns that scholars have been quietly examining for decades: the Son of Man title, the Watcher's narrative, the fallen angel lineup, the astronomical sections, the theology of judgment, and put them within reach of people who would never otherwise stumble across them. That kind of accessibility might carry more weight than any individual finding. There's a big difference between a row of academic monographs gathering dust on a university shelf and those same ideas popping up in a conversation someone's having on their phone during a quick coffee break. If the Book of Enoch was something Jesus and his followers knew well, why do you think it never found its way into the Bible most of us grew up reading? Leave your thoughts down below.